I didn't cancel the check, I just stopped answering the phone. That's the part nobody talks about. Everyone wants to know what I said, what I screamed, how I finally snapped. But I didn't snap. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Whole Foods on a Tuesday afternoon, read a single text message, and made a very quiet decision. No tears. No shaking hands. Just a kind of cold clarity that I'd never felt before in my 31 years of being the sister who always showed up. Let me back up. My brother Liam is 2 years younger than me, which means I've spent most of my life running slightly ahead of him, clearing the path, explaining things to teachers, covering for him when he was late. Our mom worked doubles at a hospital most of our childhood, so it fell to me, not because anyone asked, just because I was there, and I was older, and somebody had to. That's how it starts with people like me. You do it once, and then it becomes who you are. Liam is charming. I want to say that clearly, because I don't want you to think I'm writing about a villain. He's the kind of person who makes friends in elevator rides, who remembers your coffee order, who shows up to your birthday with a card he actually wrote in himself. Growing up, I loved him so much it hurt. He was my person. We used to sit on the back porch of our mom's house in Columbus and make plans for our lives like they were blueprints we could just follow. His dream was always a restaurant. Not a chain, not a franchise. A real place. A neighborhood spot with good food and regulars who knew his name. He used to describe it like he could already see it, down to the color of the booths and the song that would play when you walked in. I believed him when he described it. I always believed him. I started saving when I was 24. Not for his dream. For mine. I worked in healthcare administration. Not glamorous, but stable. And I was careful with money the way our mom had taught us to be. By the time I was 29, I had $68,000 in a high-yield savings account. An emergency fund, a down payment fund, a someday fund. It felt like proof that I'd done something right. Then Liam called me in March 2 years ago. He'd found a location. A former diner in Clintonville. Good bones, good foot traffic, reasonable lease. He had a business partner, his friend from culinary school. A guy named Ryan who I'd met twice and who seemed solid enough. He had a concept, a menu, a name. He had everything except capital. The SBA loan he'd applied for fell through over a credit issue from years ago. One mistake he'd been trying to outrun. He needed $50,000 to make it real. I want to tell you I hesitated. I want to tell you I asked hard questions, read the business plan carefully, consulted someone. I did some of those things. But the truth is that when my brother described that restaurant, when he said, I finally have everything in place except the one thing I can't get myself, I felt something loosen in my chest. Like this was the thing I'd been saving for without knowing it. I told him yes. We hired a lawyer. There was a promissory note, a repayment schedule, a clause about equity if the loan converted. It was real paperwork, real terms. I felt good about that. I told myself I'd been smart about it. I transferred the money in April. $50,000. More than I'd ever moved in my life. Liam called me crying. Not like he was performing. Genuinely crying. The way he used to when we were kids. And something really got to him. He said, I'm going to make you proud. I told him he already did. The next 8 months were the best version of this story. I watched him build something, watched him pick the tile for the floor and argue about the menu with Ryan and stress about the hood ventilation system at midnight. I was in that space every few weeks, helping with whatever needed doing. I painted one wall myself. Just the accent wall behind the host stand, navy blue, his choice. I joked that I'd put my name on it somewhere. He laughed and said he'd put me in the acknowledgments of the Yelp page. The restaurant opened on a Friday in December. They called it Mainline. Warm lighting, a short menu done really well, a weekend brunch that people started lining up for by the second month. Ryan handled the kitchen. Liam handled everything else. It was working. I came in for dinner on a Saturday in February, the third month of business. I didn't call ahead. I was in the neighborhood and I was hungry and it was my brother's restaurant and I figured that was enough. The host, a young woman I hadn't met, looked at the reservation list and told me it would be about 40 minutes. I said that was fine. I'd wait at the bar. She said, "Can I get a name?" I said, "Just tell Liam his sister is here." She smiled and went to find him. I sat down. The bartender brought me water. I looked around at the room, the navy wall, the warm lights, the tables full of people, and I felt something I can only describe as pride, not in myself, in him. Liam came out about 10 minutes later. He looked good, that particular kind of exhausted but happy that comes from doing something you love. He hugged me and we stood there for a minute and I asked how things were going. He said things were going great. He said they were thinking about adding weekend dinner hours in the spring. He said Ryan had been approached about a second location, nothing concrete, just early conversations. I said, "That's amazing, you did it." He smiled. And then, I don't know how to describe the shift. Something changed in his face. Not dramatic. Almost like a door closing behind someone's eyes. He said, "Hey, actually, can we talk for a second?" We walked to the back hallway, near the office door. He leaned against the wall. I waited. He said, "I've been meaning to call you. We've been looking at the financials and Ryan thinks, we both think, that for the long-term structure of the business, it makes more sense to have the initial investment categorized differently. Like operationally, it works better if it's not on the books as a loan." I said, "What does that mean?" He said they wanted to convert the agreement. Instead of repaying me, they'd offer me a small equity stake. He said something like 3% and call it settled. I stood there for a moment. I said, "Liam, 3% of a restaurant that might not survive another year is not $50,000. He said he knew, but it was what made sense for the business right now. He said Ryan had a CPA who'd looked at it. I said, "We have a promissory note." He said he knew, but he was hoping I'd be flexible. He said family doesn't need to be so transactional. He used that word, transactional. Like I was the one who'd made this weird. I didn't raise my voice. I don't know why. I just said I needed to think about it and then I got my coat and I left without having dinner and I sat in my car and looked at the texts from the last year, all the updates, all the photos of the space, all the voice memos he'd sent me at 7 a.m. because he was too excited to wait. And I understood, in a way that settled into my bones, that something had changed and I hadn't been invited to know about it. I called my friend Joanna that night. She's a paralegal and she's been my reality check for 15 years. I read her the relevant section of the promissory note. She was quiet for a second and then she said, "He can't just unilaterally change the terms. That's not how this works." I already knew that. What I needed was to hear someone say it out loud. I gave it 2 weeks. I didn't call Liam. He called me twice. Once to ask if I'd had a chance to think. Once to tell me about a write-up they'd gotten in a local food blog, like we hadn't just had that conversation. I listened. I was polite. I said congratulations on the write-up. I said I was still thinking. What I was actually doing was talking to a lawyer. Not Joanna, a real one. A civil attorney who specialized in contract disputes. I sent him the promissory note and the original wire transfer documentation and the text thread where Liam had explicitly confirmed the loan terms the week after I'd transferred the money. The attorney read it and told me my position was solid. He said I had options. I told him I wasn't ready to sue my brother. He said that was fine. He said there were other ways to start. A demand letter went out in early March. Formal, official, from the attorney's office, outlining the original terms, the repayment schedule, and my intention to pursue legal remedies if we couldn't reach an agreement within 30 days. Liam called me 9 minutes after I assume he received it. He wasn't crying this time. He said I was unbelievable. He said I was treating him like a stranger. He said I had no idea what it was like to run a business, to have real pressure, to have a partner with concerns about the legal structure. He said Ryan was threatening to pull out if the debt stayed on the books the way it was. I said, "That's a problem between you and Ryan." He said, "You're really going to do this to me?" I said, "Liam, you changed the terms of a legal agreement without telling me." I'm responding to that. This is what responding looks like. He hung up. My mom called an hour later. Then his wife, Stacy, who had always been perfectly nice to me and who now sounded like she'd been coached. Stacy said that Liam was under enormous stress and that she hoped I could find a way to be supportive without creating a legal nightmare for their family. She said she was sure we could work this out privately. I said, the demand letter is private. A lawsuit would be public. She went quiet. I said, I don't want to sue him, Stacy. Tell him to call the attorney and set up a conversation. That's all. She said she passed that along. What nobody called to say was that Mainline had a grand reopening event planned for the following Saturday. A soft rebrand, new spring menu, local press invited. They'd had a photographer booked for weeks. It was, by any measure, the biggest night the restaurant had had since opening. I found out about it from Joanna, who saw an Instagram post. I thought about that for a day. About what it meant that my brother was throwing a party and hadn't mentioned it to me. About the navy wall. About the painting I'd done with my own hands on a weekend in October when I'd taken time off work to help him. About the $50,000 that had made any of this possible. I didn't go to the event. I want to be clear about that. I didn't show up to make a scene. Didn't try to insert myself somewhere I wasn't wanted. But I did make a phone call that Friday afternoon. To Ryan. I'd met Ryan 4 or 5 times at this point. We weren't close, but I had his number from a conversation we'd had early in the renovation about logistics. I called him and I introduced myself again, since we barely knew each other, and I told him I thought he should know that there was a legal proceeding in progress related to the original capitalization of the restaurant. I was careful. I didn't threaten anything. I just said that anyone doing due diligence on the business, for a second location, for investors, for any partnership, would want to know about any outstanding claims. He was very quiet. He said, "Is there actually a claim filed?" I said, "There's a demand letter with a response window." After that, yes. He said he'd been told the initial funding situation was resolved. I said, "It's not." Another silence. He said, "I need to talk to my attorney." I said, "That seems wise. The grand reopening happened on Saturday. I don't know how it went. I know that by Sunday afternoon, Liam was calling me from a number I didn't recognize. I assume because he thought I wouldn't pick up for him, which I wouldn't have. When I answered and heard his voice, there was none of the anger from the week before. He sounded like someone who had spent the night realizing something. He said, "I need to fix this." I said, "I know." He said Ryan had gotten very concerned about the outstanding liability. He said the CPA was saying the original loan documentation was solid and that converting it without my consent would create more problems, not fewer. I said, "I know that too." He said, "I handled this wrong. I should have called you." I was listening to Ryan instead of thinking about what was actually right. He paused. "I think I convinced myself that because you love me, you'd be okay with anything. That's not how people work. That's not how you work." I sat with that for a second. I said, "No, it's not." We talked for 40 minutes. Not fighting, actually talking. The kind of conversation we used to have on the back porch in Columbus. He told me that the pressure of the business had made him feel like every dollar on the balance sheet was a threat, and that when the CPA flagged the loan structure, he panicked and made a decision without thinking it through. He told me that Stacy had actually been the one to push back on him, to say that what he was asking me to do wasn't fair, and that he'd dismissed her because he didn't want to hear it. He said he was sorry, not as a strategy, as a person. I told him I believed him. We worked out a modified repayment schedule with our attorneys over the next 3 weeks. Lower monthly payments than the original note, extended timeline but the full amount with agreed interest. Mainline stayed open. Ryan stayed on. The second location conversations continued. Nothing collapsed. I went back for dinner in April. Liam sat across from me in the booth for a few minutes between the lunch and dinner rush. He looked tired in that same exhausted but alive way, but the closed door behind his eyes was open again. He said, "The wall's still navy." I said, "Good." He said, "I told Ryan you painted it." I said, "What did he say?" He said we should have charged you labor. We both laughed. It felt like the first real breath I'd taken in months. Here's what I've been thinking about since then, when I let myself think about it. I grew up being the person who handled things, who smoothed things over and showed up and absorbed the cost of other people's decisions without adding it to anyone's tab. I thought that was love. I thought that was what it meant to be a good sister, a good daughter, a good anything. And I wasn't entirely wrong. Love is showing up. But love is also handing someone a piece of paper that says, this is what we agreed to. This is real. You don't get to make it disappear just because it became inconvenient. The $50,000 was real. The wall I painted was real. The Saturday dinners I drove 40 minutes each way to attend were real. The attorney's letter was real too. All of it. What I know now. What I wish I'd known when I was 25 and running slightly ahead of everyone, clearing the path, is that love without accountability isn't love. It's just endurance. And I am done enduring. The repayment comes in on the 15th of every month. Liam has never missed one. I've thought a lot about the version of this story where I said yes, where I nodded in that back hallway at Mainline and told Liam that 3% was fine, that family doesn't need to be transactional, that I understood the pressure he was under. I've thought about how easy that would have felt in the moment, the relief of not fighting, of keeping the peace the way I'd always kept it. I know that version of me. I was her for a long time, but here's what I've learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, about the way things actually work. What you accept becomes what people expect. Not because people are cruel, necessarily, but because we all take our cues from what the person in front of us is willing to tolerate. Liam didn't try to rewrite our agreement because he was a bad person. He tried it because somewhere in the back of his mind, shaped by 31 years of watching me absorb and adjust and make things okay, he believed I would let him. That's not a character flaw, that's a pattern, and patterns only change when someone interrupts them. I interrupted it, not dramatically, not with a scene in his restaurant or a speech about everything I'd sacrificed. Just a demand letter sent by an attorney stating plainly what was real. That's the thing nobody tells you about standing up for yourself. It doesn't always look like strength in the moment. It looks like paperwork. It looks like a phone call you make in a Whole Foods parking lot. It looks like saying, quietly, to your brother's voicemail, I'm not going to let this go. The hardest part wasn't the legal process. It was sitting with the discomfort of knowing that Liam was upset with me, that my mom was caught in the middle, that Stacy thought I was creating a nightmare. Every instinct I'd built over a lifetime of being the capable one, the steady one, the one who handled things, every single one of those instincts told me to back down and smooth it over. Resisting, that took more out of me than the $50,000 ever did. But here's what came out the other side. A brother who respects me differently now. Not because I scared him, but because I showed him, concretely, that I have edges. That my love for him is real and also as a shape. That I can be the person who painted his wall and the person who sent the attorney's letter, and both of those things are true at the same time. Joanna told me once that the people who love you most are often the ones you let treat you the worst, because you extend grace that you'd never extend to a stranger. I think that's right. And I think the correction, the real one, the lasting one, isn't anger. It isn't cutting people off or making them pay in some emotional sense. It's just clarity. Knowing what you're owed and saying so. Holding the line not to punish anyone, but because you finally decided that you are worth holding a line for. The repayment comes in on the 15th of every month. Liam has never missed one. And when I go to Mainline now, I sit in the booth by the navy wall that I painted, and I order whatever looks good, and I split the check with nobody. That wall has my name on it. Not literally, but it does.